Imagine being lowered into a giant cauldron filled with boiling water. Bubbles burst amid the rising steam. Your screams echo off the stone walls, and the crowd watches you with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. This is not a nightmare or a scene from medieval fiction. For Richard Roose in 1531, it was the grim reality. His execution is remembered as one of history's most shocking acts of judicial cruelty, not ordered by a barbaric warlord, but by one of England's most famous monarchs, King Henry VIII. This horrific method was not chosen merely for the sake of brutality. It was a unique form of punishment that reflected Tudor England's internal fears, political tensions, and concept of justice. The execution of Richard Roose is more than just a chilling historical detail. It represents a moment when politics, religion, and royal authority were brutally intertwined at a pivotal point in English history. Under Henry VIII, the king's will had become the supreme law, and acts considered treasonous were increasingly met with bloody and terrifying punishments. But how could boiling a person alive ever be considered an appropriate punishment, especially for an ordinary cook? What could he have done to deserve such a fate? To understand this dark era, we must return to a time when justice was designed not only to punish the individual, but also to serve as a public warning and a demonstration of power to anyone who might dare challenge the throne. Richard Roose's story opens a window into the Tudor world, where crime and punishment operated under principles very different from those of modern legal systems. It is a stark reminder of how far legal thought has advanced and how thin the veneer of civilization truly is. As we delve into this disturbing event, we will not only uncover how Roose died, but also why such a horrific punishment was deemed necessary by the most powerful king of his time. We will examine the political atmosphere, the religious conflicts, and the personal motivations behind this brutal act, one so severe that it would eventually be outlawed, even in an age infamous for its cruelty. This is not merely a tale of horror, it is a lesson about the destructive consequences that arise when power and fear combine. The year was 1531, and in Tudor England, the pot was about to boil. Quite literally, Henry VIII had not yet become the despotic figure history remembers, but he was already showing signs of the ruthlessness that would define his reign. The boiling cauldron in Smithfield, London, would soon become the instrument of one of history's most notorious executions, a dark testament to the immense power of England's most formidable monarch to truly grasp the horror of Richard Roose's death. We must first understand the world in which it took place. In the early 1530s, England was a powder keg of religious and political tension. Once hailed as a Renaissance prince, Henry VIII was gradually transforming into the tyrant remembered by history. His desperate desire for a male heir led him to question his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, bringing him into direct conflict with the Catholic Church and plunging the country into the upheaval later known as the English Reformation. This was a period in which the king's absolute power was being asserted with unprecedented force. Parliament was no longer a check on royal authority, but an extension of it. Laws were rewritten to suit the king's desires, and those who opposed him faced dire consequences. As the old feudal order crumbled, a new concept emerged, that of an absolute monarch accountable only to God, and increasingly equating God's will with his own. Religious fear permeated every aspect of Tudor life. The specter of heresy loomed over society as traditional. Catholics and emerging Protestant groups regarded one another with suspicion. Poisoning was seen as an especially abhorrent crime in the Tudor mindset, not merely murder, but a cowardly and treacherous act. It was often associated with women, foreigners, and those too weak to confront their enemies openly, because the king's body was considered sacred and semi-divine. Any attempt to poison the royal household was regarded not just as a crime, but as an act of sacrilege. London was a city where sanctity and brutality coexisted side by side. Squalid slums stretched out in the shadow of magnificent palaces, and the dazzling spectacle of court life stood alongside the bloody public executions that drew massive crowds. Smithfield, where Roose was to be executed, was already a center of punishment, particularly for religious dissenters who were burned at the stake there. It was a place where state power was displayed in its most tangible form, where the condemned served both as a deterrent and as theater of justice for the public. In such an environment, the role of a cook or food taster was surprisingly critical. Preparing food for the powerful meant literally holding their lives in your hands. Serving in the royal kitchen was a position of immense trust, and betrayal in such a role was considered one of the vilest crimes imaginable. Richard Roose worked in the household of John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, a man who would later be canonized as a saint, but who even then was one of Queen Catherine's most outspoken defenders against King Henry's desire for divorce. Roose was an obscure figure in history until the incident that would lead to his execution. He served one of the most respected clergymen in England and was connected to those strongly opposed to ending Catherine and Henry's marriage. Fisher's open opposition to the king's annulment plans had already made him a target of Henry's growing intolerance. The event that sealed Roose's fate occurred on February 18, 1531. Members of Fisher's household fell seriously ill after consuming the oatmeal porridge he had prepared. Two of them, a man named Bennet Serwin and an unnamed poor woman who had received food from the household's charity, died. Bishop Fisher himself became violently ill, though he survived, reportedly having eaten only a small amount. Suspicion of poisoning arose immediately, and Roose was quickly identified as the culprit. When interrogated, he admitted to adding a substance to the porridge, but claimed it was not a deadly poison, only a laxative intended to cause discomfort. This defense did little to help his case. Whether his intent was murder or merely a prank, tampering with food in a household connected to the royal court was considered an extremely serious crime. In an age before modern medicine, the line between a harmless joke and deadly poisoning was fatally thin. It was impossible to ignore the political ramifications of the incident. Bishop John Fisher was not an ordinary clergyman, but an influential opponent who openly challenged the king's policies. Although there was no direct evidence that Roose's actions were part of a conspiracy specifically targeting Fisher, the timing was highly suspicious and raised the possibility that the cook might have acted under someone else's orders. Was this a clumsy assassination attempt, a message designed to intimidate, or simply a prank that ended in disaster? These questions continue to occupy the minds of historians to this day. One thing is certain: Henry VIII personally intervened in the case. The king was centralizing power and taking steps to bring both the church and the legal system directly under his authority. The poisoning incident offered a unique opportunity to demonstrate royal power and to go beyond existing legal procedures to send a powerful message. Instead of allowing Roose to be tried through ordinary judicial channels, Henry took the extraordinary step of determining the punishment through an act of parliament. Henry VIII's response was both swift and unprecedented. Roose was not allowed to be tried through normal legal processes. The king prompted Parliament to enact a special law specifically addressing this case. The Poisoning Act of 1531 defined poisoning as a crime against the crown. In other words, high treason, and, most importantly, applied it retroactively, meaning that the law was enforced in Roose's case even though it had not existed at the time the crime was committed. The law stipulated that Roose was to be executed by being boiled alive, a punishment unprecedented in English legal history. The method was deliberately chosen for its horror and symbolic meaning. Poisoners often carried out their crimes using cauldrons and pots. Now, the instruments of their crime would become the instruments of their punishment. This was a grotesque version of poetic justice, and it clearly demonstrated that the king could not only take life, but also dictate the manner and meaning of death itself. The retroactive application of the law was extremely troubling. Even by Tudor standards, it blatantly violated the principle that a person should be judged according to the laws in force at the time of their crime, a principle recognized even by medieval jurists. But Henry VIII saw himself as above traditional legal limits. This case marked an important step in the king's assertion of his supremacy over both common law and ecclesiastical authority, and foreshadowed his eventual break with Rome and his emergence as head of the Church of England. Parliament's willingness to pass such an extreme law showed that the institution had become nothing more than an extension of royal will. Technically, it was supposed to represent the English people, but by this point, Parliament served little purpose other than to give legal form to the king's wishes. Few dared to oppose Henry directly, especially on matters in which he had shown personal interest. The poisoning case, concerning the security of both the royal family and prominent households, clearly fell into this category. The language of the act reflected the king's special disgust toward poisoning. It described the act as detestable and suggested that it had been rare in England. Until then, a foreign practice that had infected the realm. This xenophobic rhetoric was a common theme in Tudor propaganda. which portrayed England as a virtuous nation threatened by corrupting external influences. By framing poisoning in this way, Henry positioned himself as the defender of English virtue against malicious foreign habits, a narrative that would provide ideological support during his eventual break with Rome. April 5, 1531. Richard Roose was taken to Smithfield for execution. Because of the notoriety of both the crime and the punishment, a large crowd gathered to witness the extraordinary event. Public executions were common in Tudor England, serving both as entertainment and as a moral lesson for the people. However, the novelty of this particular method aroused special curiosity. The authorities encouraged this interest. The more people who witnessed royal justice in action, the further its message would spread. The execution apparatus was both simple and terrifying. A massive cauldron filled with water and heated to boiling. Unlike traditional methods such as hanging or beheading, which could result in relatively quick deaths, boiling promised a long and agonizing end. Some sources report that Roose was lowered into the cauldron slowly, rather than all at once, to prolong the agony and the spectacle for the crowd. It is unclear from historical records whether this was done by a mechanism or by executioners using ropes. Contemporary accounts of the event are scarce, but they indicate that Roose suffered greatly. The 16th century historian Edward Hall wrote that he roared loudly during the execution. His screams echoed through the streets of Smithfield, leaving a deep impression even on a public long accustomed to displays of violence. The physical effects were horrific. The boiling water caused immediate and extensive burns, leading to shock, heart failure, and death as the heat destroyed bodily tissues. Those who witnessed the event included merchants, laborers, clergy, craftsmen, and even nobles and royal officials eager to see the king's authority carried out. While their reactions were not recorded in detail, even in a society accustomed to public brutality, the cruelty of this execution stood out. Its purpose was to instill fear, and by all accounts, it succeeded. After the execution, Roose's body must have presented a ghastly sight: blistered, peeling skin and partially cooked flesh. What happened to his remains afterward is uncertain. The bodies of ordinary criminals were often denied burial, sometimes left on display as a warning, or given to medical schools for anatomical study. As a traitor, Roose's body was likely subjected to further humiliation, although the specifics are unclear. The execution of Richard Roose cast a long shadow over Tudor England. The Poisoning Act remained in force afterward, establishing a precedent that poisoning was a special crime deserving of extraordinary punishment. Roose was the first person to be executed by boiling under this law, but he would not be the last. Historical records show that at least one woman, Margaret Davy Fisher, continued to oppose the break with Rome and the divorce from Catherine of Aragon. This stance would ultimately lead to his beheading in 1535, after he refused to approve the Act of Supremacy. Some historians have suggested that the poisoning incident may have been an attempt to neutralize Fisher before his opposition grew stronger. Although there is no direct evidence to support this claim, the Roose case also starkly reveals the extraordinary legal powers accumulated by Henry VIII. Parliament's ability to enact retroactive laws targeting a specific individual demonstrates how deeply traditional legal safeguards had eroded during Henry's reign. This pattern would continue and even accelerate throughout the 1530s. Henry would use acts of Parliament to reshape both religious and secular law according to his will, culminating in the break with Rome and his self-proclamation as the supreme head of the Church of England. It is difficult to gauge the impact of the execution on the public, as records from the period are limited. Nevertheless, the unique brutality of the punishment suggests it was designed not only to inspire fear, but to generate a particular kind of horror. Poisoning was associated with secrecy, foreignness, and subversive activity, qualities that Henry increasingly attributed to his opponents, especially those loyal to Rome. By punishing poisoning so dramatically, he symbolically asserted his dominance over all invisible threats to his authority. On the international stage, the execution likely contributed to Henry's growing reputation for ruthlessness. European ambassadors regularly reported developments in England to their courts, and such an unusual punishment would certainly have attracted attention. As the break with Rome progressed, Henry's readiness to use extreme methods against those he deemed enemies became a defining feature of his image. In the eyes of both allies and rivals, the practice of execution by boiling did not survive long after Henry VIII his son, Edward VI, repealed the boiling statute in 1547, just 1 year after Henry's death. This move was part of a broader revision of treason laws, which had become overly complex and severe during Henry's reign. Edward's government was not necessarily more merciful overall. Religious persecution continued, albeit with different targets, but it appears that some of Henry's innovations in punishment were recognized as having gone too far. The repeal of the law reflects changing attitudes toward appropriate punishment, even in an era that would still be considered extremely harsh by modern standards. Public executions remained frequent and often gruesome during the Tudor and Stuart periods, but certain methods began to be viewed as excessive or barbaric. The evolution of punishment methods provides important insights into how societies redraw the line between acceptable and unacceptable violence, even within a framework where state-sanctioned killing was considered normal. For modern historians, the case of Richard Roose offers valuable insights into Tudor governance and justice. It demonstrates the personal nature of Tudor power, how the king's will could quickly become law, how punishments could be shaped according to the monarch's priorities, and how established legal principles could be subordinated to political necessity. The case is a striking example of a system in which the boundaries between personal royal authority and state governance were frequently blurred or non-existent. The execution also reveals the era's complex relationship with the concept of poison. Poison was feared not only as a method of murder, but also as a metaphor for hidden corruption and foreign influence. As Henry VIII severed ties with Rome and declared himself head of the Church of England, the idea of invisible agents rotting the body politic from within gained power. The punishment inflicted on Roose was intended not only to deter potential poisoners, but also to symbolically cleanse the kingdom of corrupting influences. From a medical perspective, Tudor understanding of poison was still heavily influenced by medieval theories of humors and contagion. Without modern toxicological knowledge, the line between spoiled food and deliberately poisoned food was not always clear. This ambiguity likely contributed to the aura of special terror surrounding poisoning cases. Poison combined the fear of murder with uncertainty about its cause and origin, making it seem particularly sinister and unnatural. The legacy of Richard Roose's execution extends far beyond its historical context. For legal historians, the case is a striking example of ex post facto law, legislation that criminalizes actions retroactively. The principle that no one should be punished for acts that were not crimes when committed is now enshrined in many modern legal systems, including the US Constitution. The Roose case stands as a cautionary tale of what can happen when that principle is violated. For political expediency, for students of Tudor politics, the execution sheds light on the complex factional struggles surrounding Henry VIII's break with Rome. Bishop Fisher, in whose household the poisoning occurred, represented the conservative Catholic faction opposed to Henry's divorce. While no direct link has been proven between the poisoning and these broader political conflicts, the context cannot be ignored. The king's personal involvement in the case and his order for such an extraordinary punishment suggests that the issue went far beyond a simple matter of criminal justice. The method of execution, boiling alive, is also significant for understanding the symbolic dimensions of Tudor punishment. Executions were never just about eliminating criminals. They were ceremonial performances that conveyed messages about power, justice, and social order. Punishments often mirrored the crime in a form of theater of justice. Traitors were dismembered because they had torn apart the kingdom. Heretics were burned because their ideas were believed to consume the body of Christ like fire. And poisoners were boiled because they had committed their crimes using cooking implements, a dark form of poetic justice. Psychologically, the choice of such an extreme method reflects specific fears and anxieties within the Tudor mindset. Poison transformed an everyday necessity, eating, into a potential death sentence. It could strike anyone, regardless of status or strength, and often left no visible trace. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and order, poisoning represented a subversive threat capable of undermining even the most carefully constructed power structures. Was boiled alive in 1542 under the same statute. This demonstrates that the punishment was not a one-time spectacle, but became, albeit rarely, an established part of Tudor penal practice. For Bishop Fisher, the poisoning incident that took place in his household made his already precarious position even more dangerous. The fact that this form of punishment was used only a handful of times in English history shows just how extraordinary it was. Even in a society where hanging, burning, and beheading were considered routine punishments, boiling was seen as extreme and exceptional. This reveals how societies construct a scale of punishment and helps us understand why certain crimes are perceived as requiring extraordinary responses. The extreme nature of the punishment is a clear indicator of the deep fear and unease that poisoning provoked in Tudor society. Richard Roose's story strongly resonates with modern readers because it sits at the crossroads of some of humanity's most fundamental concerns: the limits of state authority, the balance between crime and punishment, and the use of terror as a political tool. In a world where some governments still employ cruel and unusual punishments, Roose's execution reminds us how easily justice can cease to be a pursuit of truth or a measured response and instead become a display of state power. Henry VIII's direct involvement in the case also brings to the forefront the age-old debate between the rule of law and rule by men. The king's ability to create a special law targeting a specific individual demonstrates how dangerous it is when excessive power is concentrated in a single set of hands. Constitutional governments and the separation of powers exist precisely to prevent such arbitrary exercises of authority. Nevertheless, debates over the limits of executive power continue even in modern democracies. The public nature of punishments in the Tudor era also allows us to draw fascinating comparisons with how modern media handles crime and punishment. We no longer gather in town squares to watch executions, but stories of crime and punishment remain among the most prominent topics in news and entertainment. Humanity's fascination with the macabre and with retribution seems to have remained unchanged over the centuries. Only the ways in which that fascination is expressed have evolved with technology and social norms. For modern audiences, the medical aspects of the Roose case are particularly striking. In Tudor times, distinguishing between accidental food poisoning and deliberate poisoning was extremely difficult, a reminder of how profoundly scientific advancement has transformed our understanding of the world. Without modern forensic toxicology, many innocent people throughout history may have been punished as poisoners, even though deaths were actually caused by natural spoilage or disease. Ultimately, Roose's execution dramatically illustrates how the concept of appropriate punishment has evolved. While the death penalty remains a subject of debate in many legal systems, there is now a broad international consensus against torture and cruel punishments. Richard Roose's execution represents a moment in history when pain was not merely a side effect of punishment, but its very purpose. This notion has been largely, though not always, rejected by modern justice systems. When we examine the Roose case, we are left with far more questions than answers. Was he truly guilty of attempted murder? Or was he the perpetrator of a prank that went horribly wrong? Did he act alone? Or was he a pawn in a larger political scheme? The historical record does not provide definitive answers, leaving ample room for historians to speculate about this dark episode. What is certain is that his execution stands as a striking example of how justice has been conceptualized and administered throughout history, from the retroactive law that condemned him to the public spectacle of his death. Every aspect of the Roose case highlights the sharp contrasts between Tudor legal thinking and modern legal principles. Yet, the case also reveals continuities: the use of punishment as a form of communication, the relationship between crime and political power, and the unique horror people reserve for crimes that disrupt social order. Henry VIII's England was a realm in transition, shifting from medieval concepts of justice and kingship toward the centralized state model that would define later periods, shaped by parliamentary acts and royal intervention. The Roose case represents a critical step in this transformation. It shows a monarch increasingly willing to use innovative legal tools to assert his authority and foreshadows the religious and political changes that would soon transform England entirely. Looking back on this disturbing chapter of history, Richard Roose's execution serves as both a warning and a perspective. It warns us of the dangers of unchecked power and the cruelty that can emerge when legal principles are sacrificed to political expediency. At the same time, it holds up a mirror to our own era, reminding us how far we have come in our understanding of justice and human rights, and revealing where we still fall short. The boiling cauldron at Smithfield has long since cooled, yet the questions it raises about justice, power, and human nature continue to simmer. Richard Roose, a man who might otherwise have been forgotten by history, instead became a symbol of an era's brutality and a case study in the evolution of punishment. His horrific death, ordered by a king whose name would become synonymous with tyranny, reminds us why the restraint of power and the protection of legal principles remain vital in every age, including our own.